Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Under the Covers with me, your host, Tom Hummer. For this episode, we're going to do things a little bit different. I think I'm going to mix it up like this once every few episodes. I don't really know. I'm still trying to feel things out. But today, I have got my friend Quinn with me.
Hello.
And we are going to talk about I Can't Get No Satisfaction, the original by the Rolling Stones, as well as the cover by Devo from their debut album.
Such a good song.
We'll see how this goes. It's going to be a little less scripted, a little bit more open conversation. Let's dive right in. So, just to give a little bit of context, and then I'll pass it over to Quinn. The original Rolling Stones song came out in 1965 as a single, and the Devo song came out actually as a single before the album came out, right?
Yep.
It was, their second single? In my previous episode, I talked about Surfin' Bird and how I thought it was so peculiar that the Cramps released a cover of Surfin' Bird as their very first single. And now we have a similar situation where it's the late 70s. We've got this, kind of post-punky, new wavy band, Devo, releasing a cover of a classic Rolling Stones song to kind of establish their identity in music, which is an odd choice. But let's dive more into the history. I'm going to hand it off to you, Quinn, and you take it away.
Yeah, so just a little bit of context about the original Rolling Stones song. Tom, are you familiar with the famous story of the writing of this song, Keith Richards?
I'm really not, actually.
So Keith Richards famously wrote this song in his sleep. Yeah, he was... apparently, he had a tape recorder under his bed because it was common practice for him to fall asleep or whatever he was doing. And he would wake up in the middle of the night with this tape recorder and guitar and just record songs. Well, he woke up one morning, wanted to record a song, and found his tape was full.
Oh.
And listened back to it, and there was about a half an hour of him snoring. And then the main guitar line for Can't Get No Satisfaction. Iconic guitar line, right?
So he didn't even remember?
He didn't even remember waking up in the middle of the night and writing it. I guess now in hindsight, maybe that makes a lot more sense because those guys look like they're barely conscious and maybe have never really been. But
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But I'll tell you though, smart practice, honestly. As a musician, I've woken up in the middle of the night several times with song ideas that then you have the difficult decision of, do I get up and go figure it out and record it and disrupt my sleep, or do I fall back to sleep and hope that I remember it? And you never remember it.
Oh, absolutely.
So Keith Richards, he was smart to do it that way. He knew what he was doing.
If he hadn't done it that way, we wouldn't have this song.
No.
Apparently his original conception of it, when he woke up and started really thinking about it, was that guitar line wasn't supposed to be a guitar at all. It was supposed to be horns. It was supposed to be a horn section.
That makes perfect sense, because I'll tell you, the fuzz tone that he uses on the guitar, when it comes in right in the opening, it has this, kind of roomy, womp, womp, wah, 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 it almost sounds like a horn part. It's got that fanfare behind it.
That's the reason that they used that fuzz pedal, and actually, one of the interesting history parts of that song is that's the first major use of a fuzz pedal in popular rock music, and it was it was a killer single, right?
Yeah, it's a dirtier guitar sound than a lot of bands were doing in 1965. That's for sure.
Some studio assistant went around the block to a guitar shop after they tried to get the sound that they wanted, and just found this fuzz pedal that they'd really never used before. Plugged it in, and apparently it had the sound that Keith Richards was looking for, which was just as close to a horn as he could get without it being a horn.
Yeah. Well, damn, that's convenient.
Yeah.
Good on that engineer. He got a raise.
Yeah, I hope he did. The record label heard the song and decided that they wanted to release it as a single. They brought that decision back to the band, and Keith Richards and Mick Jagger did not want to release it as a single. Specifically, Keith Richards did not care for the song particularly, and
was there
did not think it was single worthy.
Was there a particular reason why? He
just thought it was a toss out, and I think part of that was due to the fact that it wasn't coming together the way he envisioned.
Yeah, okay, that would make sense. I mean, that's kind of tough when you're the songwriter and it's this isn't really what I had in mind, you know?
Because he wanted to do this full horn section, he wanted it to be a big full sound, and I think it just wasn't what he pictured the end result being.
Yeah.
So they ended up doing a like a full band vote.
Oh.
And Keith Richards and Mick Jagger both voted no on it being the single, like the lead single off that album. And the record label and the rest of their bandmates voted yes, and they got voted out by like a few votes.
I didn't realize that the Rolling Stones were so democratic. I kind of just have always pictured Richards and Jagger as this like domineering force, you know?
I just always assumed it was like a Beatles situation, right? Before I started reading about this, I just figured, they're bringing the songs to the table that they want to write. And then, like, they kind of pitch in and help work on them.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently not. I guess, like, because they were talking to the record label about how they wanted to put this song out and what instrumentation they wanted. And, like, there's apparently a bunch of different versions.
Interesting. So when I was preparing for this, I basically just had these two songs, like, on repeat over and over again. Just listening to them, like, a dozen times in a row, back to back, the original and Devo's cover.
If for what it's worth, I've done that before preparing for this before.
That's just common practice in your life.
Every now and then.
You just gotta inject yourself with some satisfaction. So whenever I'm putting my thinking hat on for preparing to talk about something like this in this capacity, I always notice things that I never noticed before. And these are some of my observations about the original I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones that I'd never really noticed before. Because this is one of those songs that's just kind of ubiquitous, you know? It's just everywhere. Growing up, like, you don't remember the first time you heard it. At least if you're in our generation, if you're younger than, if you were born after 1965.
It's such a rock icon. Like, it's a rock icon.
Right.
When you think of rock music, you're thinking of like that as like its beginnings.
Right. It's like it was always there. And now that I was kind of digging into it a little bit more, the first thing I noticed that struck me as interesting about this song that I never noticed before is some of the instrumentation. First off, the drums are just doing the same on beat like snare on every beat, just driving thing. There's not really any like flam or swing. There's really not even a whole lot of variation in like the snare or the hi-hat patterns. There's not really much in the way of fills. It's very just on beat, anchoring things down, except for like those couple spots where it gets a little lower.
Yeah.
Some of the instruments drop out, but even then, the drums, for the most part, kind of stay the same. Which, it's an interesting beat. You don't hear a lot of rock drummers anymore just kind of just going, duh, 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 just snare every beat. Like, why don't I just always hit the snare?
A lot of that's happening during that, that fuzzed out guitar line. Mm-hmm. And it makes a lot of sense that he wrote that in a dream because it feels fever dreamish.
Yeah, it kind of does.
Like it's repetitive and like I don't know. It's if you were to just listen to that line on repeat with those drums, it would probably start to feel creepy after a little while.
Yeah, it's kind of hypnotic.
But like then when they snap into the verses, it starts to feel a little bit more like rock R&B.
Yeah. And Jagger's vocals really tie the whole thing together.
Oh, yeah.
It's what sets the dynamics, because the instrumentals aren't really doing a whole lot dynamically. Like, they're either there or they're not. And Jagger's vocals just set the tone, because he comes in with that kind of like whispered, I can't get no, to start things off. And then when he gets to the end of the whole progression and he's screaming that line a little bit more, and that fuzz guitar comes back in, like you've really reached a climax. It really announces itself.
That's a great point. He really does bring the emotional, like it's not an emotionally intense song, obviously. Like, yeah, there is sort of an acting that goes on with it in just like the way that he delivers some of those smooth lines at first, but then he builds and builds and builds.
Yeah. There's definitely an arc to it. But still, the guitar, I noticed a lot more guitar happening in the verses while the vocals are going than I ever had before.
Yeah.
Keith Richards is really kind of working his ass off. He's throwing these little licks in, but they're a little bit buried in the mix. But they sound cool. They're kind of bluesy and fun and add a little life to the song. It's funny because, this is back in the 60s in the days of live recording, just getting a group of guys in a room together and just turning the mics on, hitting record and seeing what happens. It's very imperfect in the way that the transitions happen because you can almost hear the delay of like the guitar changing effect.
Yeah.
Like there's a moment where it's like, oh, gotta stomp this pedal and then switch to the other line, you know?
It's old 60s live recording.
Right, exactly. And to be honest, I don't know exactly like where the line between Keith Richards and Brian Jones and the guitar parts are during that song, because I know, my understanding at least, is that they're both playing, but it's a little hard to distinguish.
I'm pretty sure Keith Richards is the one playing like that lead guitar.
The lead guitar
the
line.
Verses too. And I do know that they deliberately switched to like a more standard guitar sound for that, and it was supposed to be a counterbalance to that.
Gotcha.
That
Okay.
fuzz.
Yeah. That makes sense then. And also, one last instrumental observation. The bass is actually kind of working against the guitar rhythm, if you really pay attention. This is a really minor note, but like where you have that very syncopated dut, da-da-da, that kind of comes in on the offbeat, the bass is kind of just thunking on the onbeat. So there's a couple spots where the bass and the guitar kind of alternate with the beats. And it's kind of neat. I think that's just, at least my hypothesis would be, Bill Wyman, the bass player, is probably just trying to sync up with Charlie on the drums and have that rhythm section anchor while the guitar is just kind of working on top of it. It feels like a very classic decision to make.
It makes sense. It grounds the song.
Yeah, exactly. Last observation, though, what I want to shift from instrumentals on the original is the lyrics. This is one of those songs, I'd never really paid attention to the lyrics to this song, to be honest. I'm a little bit embarrassed by that, but it's also kind of like, you know, the I can't get no satisfaction and hey, 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 that's what I say. Like, that's the hook. That's what you remember of this song. Once Jagger jumps into the, and I'm driving in my car, and I'm blah, 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 and I'm blah, blah, blah. Like I kind of tune out a little bit. I'm just kind of like, yeah, whatever, man, you sing it. Because he's got the conviction going. But when I really paid attention to the lyrics, I'm like, what are you saying that you can't get any satisfaction? Like there's an ad on TV that you don't like. You're hearing an ad on the radio in your car that you don't like. Like
he's kicking back against the man.
Right.
He's kicking at capitalism and corporate greed.
Right. And that actually, like, at first I was kind of like, what the hell is he actually talking about? And then I kind of turned around on it based on what you were just saying, because I'm like, you know, he's actually making some like social commentary here that I feel like wasn't necessarily in a lot of Stones music from that era. It's still kind of disguised in, you know, with just this fun raucous song, but like there's actually a little bit more to dig at there, which I like. Yeah,
it's interesting because I guess in an era just before social consciousness started becoming like a huge thing, in like I guess steamrolling into the late 60s, they were really kicking, like, I'm not joking, they're kicking against the man. Like, that was kicking against corporatism.
Yep.
At the time.
And then for the very last verse, it shifts into more of a like female relations kind of thing.
He is like hitting on like sexuality, like sexism a little bit. And
which in a way, like when you hear a 1960s rocker saying, I can't get no satisfaction, like that's where your mind goes. Like Mick Jagger was a sex symbol back then. He very much had that energy about him. You know, he introduces that verse with the line, I believe it's girl reaction, but it kind of sounds like girly action when we get to the Devo version. We'll revisit that. I listened to that really closely, like a million times, and I think he actually says girl reaction, but I'm not entirely sure. It's kind of interesting how he's changing the subject matter there and making you think differently about what the concept of satisfaction is in the context of this song.
Well, I mean, if you were, I guess if you pluck those lyrics out and make them modern, like, you know, just everyday satisfaction in life, right?
Right, yeah. And it becomes a little bit more relatable, a little bit more
like this, you know, this big world. There's so much going on that it's hard to ground yourself.
Right. All right. So fast forward 12 years later, which is funny because now as a guy in my 30s, 12 years doesn't seem like a super long time.
Right.
But in terms of music evolution from the mid 60s to the late 70s, it was like a gulf, you know? It was like an abyss, this huge gap a lot had changed in music during that time, and certainly a lot had changed in the Rolling Stones' career. So that brings us to 1977, 78, I believe, when Devo was doing Satisfaction as a single.
Yeah, that single's actually how they kind of got their start, kind of how they got their break, was they started getting known around for that cover specifically. And they weren't the first ones to cover it. It's actually a pretty well covered song before then.
The Residents.
The Residents. That's a nightmare of a song.
It really is. We could have included that one here, but that just felt like a hellhole to fall into.
That's all we would have said about it. It's and really like the point of them doing that song. I think they've even said this is like it's pretty much just like screw that song.
Yeah,
like they didn't like
sounds about
conventional rock.
Yeah.
Devo decided to cover that song. They were playing it live, and their actual first national exposure was playing that on SNL.
Really?
Did you know that they got picked up by SNL to play that song?
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's actually, I think somebody just recently did it like HD, so you can actually see it. It's not fuzzy.
Oh, shit. I'll have to find that.
You'll have to find it. It's really good. But they got picked up playing that on SNL. And they got famous off of it. Basically, they got picked up by a record label. I guess to rewind a little bit, when they decided to record that song for their album, they had to go. Well, they talked to the record label about it, and to cover a song, you don't necessarily have to ask the band or the record label for the rights if you're just doing a straight cover of the song. However, Devo's record label decided that because this might be considered a parody or an insult.
They're not wrong, really.
They demanded that Devo, Mark Mothersbaugh, personally to ask Mick Jagger himself if they could record the song.
It's quite the business meeting.
Oh, yeah. He went over there. One of their other band members went with him. I guess apparently they went like in the late afternoon, and they basically woke him up. And he was, I guess, drinking wine, like right out of bed, and like pretty much out of it. And they were asking him if they could cover the song, which I guess he didn't really have much of a problem like on its face, because so many people had covered that song by that point.
Yeah.
And they had to play it for him too, so that he knew what he was getting himself into. And they said for the first half of the song, he's just like looking at the ground, like not moving or speaking or like making noise. They didn't know what to think, and I can only imagine how nerve-wracking that must have felt.
Yeah.
You're playing this song that could be viewed as a mockery in front of apparently like one of their idols.
Yeah.
They love the Stones. Halfway through the song, Mick Jagger comes alive, starts doing like a chicken dance, I think is what they...
I'm getting like Weekend at Bernie's 2 imagery here.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen Mick Jagger dance, right? The way that he's like shaking his head and stuff. He kind of does have like a chicken dance thing going on. But that's what he started doing, I guess, and he just said, I love it, you can do it. That's how they got permission. They had to go to him and ask.
That's amazing.
It would be a horrifying experience.
It really would. It really would. So, there's a lot to dissect here. Let's dive in to the music first, and then I've got some thoughts about just some more existential questions about the mere concept of this cover.
I think that's where this has to go.
Kind of mind-bending. So first off, I mean, to state the obvious, this thing, aside from the lyrics, is hardly recognizable as the original.
Absolutely.
The signature guitar part that defines the original is simply not there, in any form. There's no melodic existence of it in this cover. What we have is a very disconnected drum beat, which is classic Devo. I mean, Devo standing for de-evolution and everything, they really incorporate that mantra into their sound so well because that drum beat is so disconnected and so de-evolved.
It's robotic.
Yeah. Really, only one thing is being hit at a time. You're so used to hearing drummers who are hitting things with both hands and a foot or two at the same time.
Yeah.
And this is just like one at a time. I'm sitting here doing the motions, and Quinn, you can see it, but no one else can.
It's great.
But it looks robotic. If you picture someone playing that beat, it looks robotic. It sounds robotic. You're absolutely right about that. So none of that driving on beatness that we talked about with the original. And then the bass line comes in and it's totally alien. It's totally its own thing.
I've got a theory about this. Tell me if you can hear this in the bass line. I think that the way that they did the bass line, it's kind of a chopped up version of that guitar line. It's like a dissected and like re-put together version of that guitar line. It's all the notes.
Yeah, you're right. It's almost like they wanted to do a cover that if they had just changed the lyrics, they wouldn't even have got permission. It wouldn't even be a cover.
Yeah.
Which we'll come back to the music, but now I just feel like I gotta go down this rabbit hole. It just makes me question, and I love this cover, but I'm gonna throw a little bit of shade on Devo right now. It as I continue to think about this, it makes me feel like was this just a gimmick? Was this just their like get famous quick scheme? Because it's a good song, it's a good cover, but I feel like if all they did was change the lyrics and have it be an original song, keep everything else the same, it wouldn't be as memorable. What makes it memorable is that it does kind of, even if lovingly so, it kind of spits in the face of the original. It's built on the foundation that the original built, but like its identity musically is so unique that it's like, why didn't they just make it a completely different song, So
Devo is definitely, or at least at this time, they had a shtick. I don't know if you've ever seen them do like early stuff live, like if you've ever seen videos of them. They had like a robot thing going on where like they were basically like pretending to be like music robots, just like
Kraftwerk almost.
Basically, yeah. Yeah, Kraftwerk with like probably less feeling.
Yeah, true.
The way I always conceptualize this song is it almost feels like they ripped apart Can't Get No Satisfaction and fed it into like a music robot from like the 50s, like the very first robot that ever existed. They're like, they just fed the music into that and the music robot spits it out. Yeah. And that's the song. Because that's basically what it is. It's ripped up parts of the original song put together in a very sparse arrangement.
That's fair, yeah. Sparse arrangement, that really is the best way to describe this, because there is a lot of space between the instruments, where the original is so saturated, not only because of the performances and the arrangement, but also just because of the recording style.
Do you want to know something ironic about that? Do you know who produced this song, and actually the entire album? I don't think you can guess.
Was it Eno?
Brian Eno and David Bowie.
Really?
Yeah, and you know who was in competition to work with Bowie on it before Eno came on board was Iggy Pop.
Oh, really? Well, Iggy Pop and Bowie were working together a lot in this era.
They recorded it in Germany, even.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it would have been during the Berlin. Okay, that all makes sense. Yeah, I didn't know all that.
History snapping into place, right?
No kidding. Well, that kind of makes sense because, some of the sounds are similar to what you'd hear on, like, Low and Heroes from the Bowie catalog.
But just without any of the warmth that you would get from some of those Eno arrangements.
Right.
And apparently this was a contentious thing in the recording of the song. Well, the recording of the entire album. Eno wanted a lot more warmth, and he had, like, I guess he brought a bunch of synth parts on board, and, like, he brought, like, a bunch of ideas of his own, and he was playing it for the band. And the band basically stripped down all of Brian Eno's ideas. The balls of this band from Ohio to, like, show up and Brian Eno's recording your album for you with David Bowie in Germany. And you're like, yeah, this is all garbage. We don't want anything that you're doing. So it's influenced by Brian Eno, just like you say, but like they also stripped a lot of that Eno-esque stuff out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and then Bowie just arranged it. Really, that's what it comes down to. Is it was the song that Devo wanted, arranged by David Bowie.
Okay, yeah, because Eno is all about the saturation and the atmosphere.
Yeah,
and you definitely don't get that here. But there is something that when I listen to the Devo version, it's kind of humorous to me because it feels so anxious. Like they're playing this kind of like stumbling beat, but it's got this drive to it. And then Mark Mothersbaugh comes in with the vocals, and it's just so frantic,
Yeah.
Satisfaction, like it's all over the map. And it's got this just barreling energy that when he starts with the verse, you're like, is he even following the rhythm? Like, how is he going to fit this into one musical repeat of this verse? But then he does. Like, the timing somehow works out. But when he's doing it, it just feels like he's falling into a pit.
Yeah, it's
so
it's
cool,
round
though.
peg, square hole. Like, they just spend the whole time trying to, like, jam that peg into, like, the square hole. And, like, they just never do. And the whole song is just that tension of, like
it's about to fall apart at any moment.
Absolutely. And I really think that whether it was intentional or not, they really nailed that energy, because it brings the message of the original song, like corporate world and greed, and into like the Cold War era, like the full-on Cold War, like anxious, nervous, panicky feeling.
Yeah. And take that panic, that anxious feeling, and also what I just described, and I think it's worth noting that the Devo cover is like a full minute shorter than the original.
Is it really?
Yeah, the original's like 3 minutes 40 seconds. The Devo cover's about 2 minutes 40 seconds.
So they really jammed that out.
Yeah, and it's not because they're cutting out huge sections of the song. I mean, well, they kind of are. They're cutting out those instrumental bits where the guitar line is highlighted in the original, but that kind of adds to that anxiety of the song. Is Mark Mothersbaugh just seems so ready and so like in a rush to get to the next part of the song each time. There's not that space between verses and choruses that you get in the original. He's just kind of going forward. But another thing worth noting along those lines is in the original, we talked about how Mick Jagger is he's kind of the maestro. He's kind of the conductor of the song. He's controlling and dictating the dynamics. There are hardly any dynamics in the Devo version.
There are no dynamics.
And I think that contributes to the more robotic quality that you're describing, because Mark Mothersbaugh is always frantic, but he's never singing quietly. He's never like screaming either. He's at like a 5 or 6 on the intensity scale, but he's at like a 9 on the tension scale. And those are a little bit different to me,
I think that there's a notch on his microphone that's like, 1, 2, 3, 4 Mothersbaugh, 6,
Yeah.
7.
Yeah,
he does always kind of have like the same delivery.
Yeah, he's just right in the middle. He's Mr. Reliable. So he's very consistent throughout this song, but it's just so even. It doesn't have any of those ebbs and flows that you would get from like a natural 5 guys in a room rock performance like the original had. So that's another way that it very much contrasts. But there's one quality to this song that I would say both versions have in spades, and that is swagger.
Yes.
And I don't know how else to capture that, but like, obviously Mick Jagger had swagger, right? I mean, they even rhyme. What more do I need to say? Like, that just sets itself up. But obviously the Rolling Stones had the attitude. Devo are kind of these weirdo outcasts, but they still come into this song with such certainty. It manifests a little differently. It comes off as a little like geeky and outsider, but also like everything that Mark Mothersbaugh is doing in his vocal performance has so much confidence and certainty behind it. He knows exactly what he wants to do. He's so sure of it, and he just owns it. And that's something that I think is inherent to the spirit of the song itself, that despite all of the musical differences, despite the fact that the Devo cover doesn't sound anything musically like the original, there's still a spirit there that's really captured and represented in the cover that stays true to the original. And I think that's quite an accomplishment, really, to be able to capture that spirit in a way that on paper sounds nothing like the original.
Also, what's interesting is, I guess other people can't see this, but it's very fortunate that you're right in front of a Ramones poster. Because like this song, they're recording this song in 78, and what was the Ramones' first album, 77?
Yeah, 76.
76. Yep. So we're talking like right at the beginning of like the full-on punk movement,
yep.
Like, when it was getting popular in the mainstream, or at least, to the extent that punk did.
yeah, exactly.
But like, that's the kind of energy that they're bringing to it too. It really is like it doesn't sound like a punk song like in the Ramones
Yeah.
sense of it, but like the feeling, the vibes, like the meaning behind the song, I think really is punk rock because they're kicking against not only like the original intent, against society, but also against like the Rolling Stones and like old rock. Like this is our new version. This is how we freshen up like an old standard.
Yeah. There was a lot of that. And I didn't do this deliberately at all. When I was planning out these first few episodes, having this one come right after
Surfin' Bird,
the Trashmen, the Ramones, and the Cramps. And when the Ramones Surfin' Bird came out, it was on their third album. They'd been around a bit.
That really was like the punk rock version of like surf rock. Like
right, exactly.
That's really what they were doing.
Exactly. And the Cramps version, I mentioned this a little bit in the episode, but it's so interesting to me that the Cramps kicked off their whole career with a cover of a song from 15 years before or whatever, and then Devo kind of did the same thing. But when you think about it, it makes sense because they could have had this just be a completely different original song. But by basing it off of and kind of defacing this classic, they're making a different kind of statement.
They automated the song basically and they hollowed it out.
Right. And to do that to a song that was so beloved makes more of a statement musically than if they had just done an original with these same instrumentals. And I think that's what they're going for. I think that they, all of these punk and post-punk bands back then were very intentional about I'm going to create my identity based off of this thing that you already know and are familiar with, but I'm going to tell you how I'm different.
Yeah, and they were trying to point out, like, especially rock bands of that time, like by the late 70s, you think of like Pink Floyd or you think of like later days Led Zeppelin. There was so much extravagance.
Oh, yeah.
And things had gotten so complicated and like prog rock and like all these just excessive rock songs. Punk rock came in and like Devo was a part of it in, a more tame way, pointing out the hollowness of that extravagance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the intent behind their cover. I think that they were really kind of pointing their finger backwards and trying to show that music's old, dated, too extravagant, too much.
Here's how we're going to take it into the future.
They skimmed it down.
Mm-hmm. All right, so to wrap things up here, Quinn, I think it's fair to say you and I both really like this cover.
Great cover.
We both see it as a big success. Devo definitely accomplished what they were setting out to do with this thing. And there's really, nothing else quite like it. I think it's really neat as it stands as kind of an example of how music was evolving from the 60s into the 70s and then into the 80s with the mid to late 70s punk and post-punk movement kind of being a bridge between these eras and really like being influenced by what was going on in the 50s and 60s, but taking that and twisting it into its own thing. And I think that Devo's cover of I Can't Get No Satisfaction really stands as a testament to that, and alongside a lot of really classic, great covers of all time. It's really one that comes to mind when I think about this kind of stuff, which is why I wanted to have this as an early episode of this show and bring you in, Quinn, since you're a Devo mega fan. So
hey, I appreciate that. Can I tell you a quick thing?
Oh, yeah.
The music league that we're both in,
mm-hmm.
I submitted this one week for Covers Week,
mm-hmm.
and I thought I was going to crush it, and nobody liked it.
That's so sad.
So I hope whoever's listening to this likes this cover more than everyone in our music league did.
Everyone was very mistaken on that one. I think I do remember that. We might have just been with maybe a not so open crowd. Or else maybe they had all just heard it before and they're kind of like, whatever. But I doubt that. I somehow doubt that. But Quinn, thank you again for joining me and being the inaugural guest host on this show. I really appreciate it. You'll definitely have to come back. We'll think of another one to do at some point. And I'll have some other guest hosts on this show as well. Like I said, probably once every few episodes just to mix things up. Thank you all for listening. In the description, I've got a link to a Spotify playlist that has all of the covers we talk about on this show. So dive in, take a listen through the Rolling Stones original, the Devo cover. If you feel like you've been sleeping way too well, check out the Residents cover. That that one's a good dose of fresh hell to really wake up to in the morning. So check that out if you are so inclined, and be sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Thanks again, Quinn, for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time.